Excellent. I think we're ready to go. Welcome to the first online talks on Turkey. These talks are organized by 3 leading research networks in European universities committed to the study of modern Turkey. These are the Consortium of European Symposia on Turkey, Blickwechsel, and Network Turkey. My name is Kerem Öktem. I'm the Keyman Visiting Professor for Turkish Studies at Northwestern University, and it is a great pleasure to be your host today. With the online talks on Turkey, we seek to provide a space for presentation of new research on politics and society in Turkey, and to create an international medium of critical reflection on larger trends on the global scale. In this first talk, we will unpack the contested notion of emerging powers and examine 2 countries that have come to represent this very notion, Turkey and Brazil. Both countries have experienced almost simultaneous trajectories of rise and fall, of success and failure. First, they were the big emerging powers and success stories of economic boom and democratic consolidation. Then they became, of course, the examples of democratic backsliding, authoritarianization, and populist strongman politics. And now they are cases of aggravating crisis and scenarios of doom and bust. Our speakers today, with whom we will explore these issues, are Karabekir Akkoyunlu and Bilge Yabancı. Karabekir Akkoyunlu will deliver our lecture. Welcome, Karabekir. Karabekir is a visiting scholar at the Institute of International Relations at the University of São Paulo, and also a research associate at the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz. His work lies at the intersection of history, international relation, and comparative politics, and focuses on Turkey, Iran, and now more recently on Brazil. His latest project explores the militarization of politics in Brazil, while he's also working on a book manuscript on the rise and fall of Brazil and Turkey as emerging powers, which of course is the basis of today's discussion. He has a forthcoming monograph on tutelary democracy entitled Guardians of the Order, Tutelary Democracy in Iran and Turkey. Secondly, we have Bilge Yabancı, who is our discussant today. Welcome, Bilge. Bilge is Marie Skłodowska Curie Fellow at the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage of Foscari University of Venice. She's also a former Open Society Fellow. In her current research, she asks how civil society and the judiciary become instruments of social control and the manufacturing of consent in hybrid regimes. Her 2 latest publications relevant for our discussion today are Turkey's Tamed Civil Society, Containment and Appropriation under a Competitive Authoritarian Regime in the Journal of Civil Society, and the wonderfully named Work for the Nation, Obey the State, Praise the Ummah, Turkey's government-oriented youth organizations in cultivating a new nations in the journal Ethnopolitics. Now, before giving the word to our speakers, I'd like to share with you a few logistical points. First of all, this is a recorded session, so be aware of that. When you leave questions in the chat box, that will also be available in the future. We do have a Q&A session, by the way, even though you will have realized that participants are muted and invisible, but we are very interested to hear your questions and comments. So please write your questions and comments into the chat window, indicating your name and institutions. And you can start as you're listening to the discussion, as your ideas come up. Don't wait until the very end, because otherwise it will be harder to get those questions to our speakers. And if you encounter any technical problems, please also write into the chat box. We have our admin team and support team in Berlin who will try to do their best to resolve that if there are any issues. Now, the time framework for this event is about 45 minutes, so we will be starting right away. Dear Karabekir, the floor is yours to talk about emerging powers, failing or falling stars.
Thank you very much, Kerem, and thank you to the organizers for this online lecture on Turkey. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be the first speaker. Kerem, you've already introduced the framework that I'm going to be speaking about, and let me just share with you a few slides just to illustrate, hold on, oops, right here. To illustrate more graphically what I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to return to my own screen in due course to finish off the presentation. So emerging powers, falling stars, Brazil and Turkey in the 21st century. Now, when we talk about Turkey and Brazil in today's conjuncture, we talk about them as two countries that sort of reflect the global zeitgeist. You know, you can find the two countries under the tags of right-wing populism, authoritarian decline, ultranationalism, growing impact of religion in politics, politicization of the judiciary, militarization of government, criminalization of the opposition, attacks on media, civil society, universities, whatnot. And of course, the poster boys for this wonderfully depressing stories are the two people, two men, strong men you see on your screens and on the covers of The Economist, Jair Bolsonaro, president of Brazil, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president. They have certain similarities, but also a lot of differences. They're both sort of Trojan horses of democracy, if you will, but Erdogan has been in the game for much longer. He's been a political operative for his entire career. He's a grassroots organizer, and he's also a trendsetter in populism and study of populism as well. His movement has gradually captured the state apparatus and suppressed civil society, whereas Bolsonaro is a relative newcomer to the game. He's a bit like Trump, a social media phenomenon, doesn't really have organizational experience. He depends on the military, and he really sets a trend with his extreme discourse, especially in the context of this COVID-19 pandemic. But what is interesting to me, as someone who takes a longue durée look at Turkey, but now living and working in Brazil, is not just the current picture, but the trajectory that these countries have gone through and reached in today's moment. And in that regard, it's important to remember that not so long ago, Turkey and Brazil were two countries that reflected another international zeitgeist, if you will. One of much more positive sort of emerging powers narrative, where they were receiving widespread praise in especially Western liberal democratic circles for their popularly elected governments overseeing impressive economic growth, social political reforms, relative democratization, and increasingly assertive regional and global ambitions. And more importantly, most importantly perhaps, they were praised or held up as some sort of a model, not only for the region, but globally, and not only for the times that they lived in, but for all the times almost, for having reconciled, supposedly, through nonviolent and democratic means, fundamental social political conflicts. In the case of the Workers' Party and Brazil, the conflict between capital and labor. And in the case of the AKP in Turkey, the conflict, supposed conflict between Islam or political Islam and liberal democracy. Now, this is not just a sort of coincidental story of rise and fall that I'm just noticing because I've come to live in Brazil, but when you actually go deeper into the sort of milestones of this process, you realize that its simultaneity is actually quite striking. Let me give you four symbolic dates or eras that were shared by both countries and symbolized, reflected the emergence, the rise, the decline, and the fall of this emerging power, rising democracy narrative. We start with the first date, 10 December 2002. This is the day, the same day when both President-elect Lula of Brazil and Recep Tayyip Erdogan of the newly victorious AKP walking to the White House, Lula in the morning, Erdogan in the afternoon, seeking an audience with George W. Bush and his team to basically make the case that they're not the bad socialists, they're not the bad Islamists, but they're the pink socialists, not in those terms, obviously, and the moderate Islamists, the guys who are willing to work with the status quo powers, whether domestically or internationally, and are not interested in rocking the boat. So in a sense, this is a symbolic moment reflecting the absorption of socialism in the case of Brazil and political Islam in the case of Turkey into the neoliberal framework. And that is also the story for the first decade of these two countries and two governments. The second date is 17 May 2010. This is the sort of peak of emergence, if you will. Brazil and Turkey come together to propose an alternative nuclear deal for the Iran nuclear standoff. This is rejected by the United States and the P5+1 countries, but nonetheless, it symbolizes a sort of revisionism and ambition on the part of these emerging powers. They're no longer willing to just follow the trends set by traditional powers and global actors. The picture changes in June and July of 2013, again in a simultaneous fashion, in these anti-government mass protests that happen in the two countries and are actually inspired by one another as well, especially the Brazilian case had a lot of inspiration from the Turkish Gezi protests, which revealed something that for outsiders was something new, not so much for perhaps those who were on the inside, that beneath the shiny surface there was something rotten going on in these countries in general, not just about the government, but this wasn't so much the shiny sort of a story of rise that was widely assumed to be until that part. And things start rolling down from that point on. We have corruption allegations, corruption investigations, power struggles that culminate in mid-2016 in both countries in a series of sort of coup attempts or symbolic coup attempts, if you will. In the case of Brazil, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff as president and the end of the Labour Party government through a parliamentary or judicial coup, and in the case of Turkey, a failed military coup attempt. And the rest is history, the rest is where I started. It's a free fall decline, very open and wild one into authoritarianism, all the way to what we would say fascism. So what I'm interested in is to look at and try to understand what happened from this comparative perspective and explain the story of simultaneous rise and fall. So what the comparative perspective allows me to do and forces me to do is to get out of our conventional perspectives that look into specific countries or even specific regions and force me to think outside the box to try to understand what is common as well as what is different in these two cases that are so wide apart from each other, geopolitically, historically, culturally, yet so similar in this sort of trend. And that is the subject matter of a book project that I'm embarking upon now. I'm going to stop the PowerPoint and I'm going to go back to my video screen. I'll continue then, if everyone can see me. So the general argument I'm building and I'd like to put forward is that the conflicts that were presumed to be resolved in the first place during the 2000s were not resolved at all. In the framework of neoliberalism, they were merely managed by pragmatic and flexible leaderships who existed in a period of favorable international economic and geopolitical conditions. So the pie was large enough economically and politically to distribute to different interest groups. But as the moment this pie started shrinking, the underlying tensions, suspicions, clashes of interest, rivalries resurfaced with a vengeance, setting in motion openly the process of democratic decline and fall. So that is the general argument. And there's one more puzzle that I'm actually interested in within this general question. And I'm going to emphasize that a little bit more in the rest of this presentation. And it is the fact that while in Brazil, this crisis of liberal democracy runs parallel to the rise and fall of the Workers' Party government, and then the rise of Bolsonaro as its ideological nemesis. In Turkey, the architects and the lead actors of both the earlier liberal moment and the subsequent authoritarian turn are one and the same. It is the Justice and Development Party, AKP, and more specifically its President Erdogan. We could say that AKP has changed a lot through this period, so it's not the same party, but Erdogan is the same person, and he's survived. He's still the dominant actor in Turkish politics. In other words, Erdogan is both Turkey's Lula and it's Bolsonaro. Or maybe we could say it's Maduro because it's more geopolitically relevant and similar perhaps. So the puzzle within the puzzle for me is how to make sense of this divergence. What does it tell us about politics and dynamics of politics and society and international relations in Turkey vis-a-vis Brazil? There are several avenues that I'm exploring. This is at a sort of hypothesis building stage, perhaps, but I'll just touch upon them before I finish, and then we can discuss them further. So there's in my view, a combination of structural, institutional, and agency-related factors that might help us understand this divergence. How come Erdogan survived while the Workers' Party in Brazil collapsed during this process? And the nature of the sort of power struggle. In the case of Turkey, on a structural geopolitical level, we could say that the power struggles that the government was engaged in from the very early on was a lot more cutthroat, a lot more ruthless, more insecurity inducing than those that were in Brazil. So the nature of the power struggle also produced a government that was much more willing to go for survival at all costs, you know, whether it was a threat of overthrow and closure by the military and the judiciary in the first place, in the first years, or the vicious intra-Islamist infighting that followed, or the insecurity-inducing dynamics of the post-Arab Spring Middle East, especially the rise and fall of Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and Egypt. A similar situation is not seen in the case of Latin America and Brazil. So perhaps this is one of the explanations. A second avenue of explanation could be the political systems that allowed for Erdogan and the AKP's dominance. And here there's an interesting insight, because the classical literature on presidentialism tells us that it's the presidential systems that are more prone to democratic breakdowns and authoritarian decline. But in the case of Turkey, it was Turkey's parliamentary system with semi-presidential characteristics that allowed a popular party that gained in the first place 34% of the vote to dominate both the legislature and the executive, keep that domination for years, and control agenda setting and law implementation without having to deal with parliamentary coalitions and concessions in a way that was dogging the Labour Party, Workers' Party in Brazil for a long time. So the parliamentary setting of Turkey allowed the AKP to capture the state in a way that wasn't possible in Brazil. And finally, and I'm going to wrap up with this, decline to authoritarianism is not a destiny, it's not a structural or institutional foregone conclusion. It was also very much a political choice by key political actors, especially at critical junctures. And this is when we really see a difference between the key political actors, Lula and Erdogan, even though they share a common story of rags to riches, working class heroes rising to the pinnacle of power, and a shared sort of pragmatism and flexibility in their political approach. The main difference in their persons and ultimately in their movements was that Lula was a Democrat and Erdogan isn't. Erdogan's ultimate interest was accumulating and staying in power, and he showed willingness to instrumentalize democracy, rule of law, or populism in order to make that happen. This wasn't observed in the case of Brazil. So the question I would like to leave you with is whether somebody like Erdogan could have made it in Brazil, could have achieved what he achieved, such thorough state capture in a completely different socio-political setting as Brazil. I guess the story of Bolsonaro will give us some hints about that. But I'm going to stop now so that we can have the discussion.
Thank you, Karabekir. Thank you very much for your unpacking of the illusions of the emerging powers of Brazil and Turkey. And Bilge, now the floor is yours for your comments.
Right, great. Thank you very much, first of all, Kerem, and all the organizers for initiating this series of online seminars. And I'm very happy to be a part of the Kickstart event. And thank you very much, Karabekir. I think you covered a lot for two very complicated political transformations in just about 15 minutes. And I think you did so in a so orderly and clear fashion, which is definitely not an easy task. So for my part, as Kerem said, I will try to respond, and I'll do this by basically throwing a few thoughts for further consideration for you as you work on your project, but actually for all of us when we do research on these de-democratizations or on the post-transition paradigm world, if you like. So I'll try to structure my reflections around the two issues, and I'll try to be as neat and clear as you, hopefully. And so the first thing that came to my mind when you were talking is that there is this question about our ontological assumptions about the overall role of the structure. So I would like to challenge you a little bit or push you a little bit on the potential causal determinism we tend to display here. So I think when we talk about structures, this international system or the domestic structures, in researching the nature of these transformations, we tend to take them given and kind of forget to unbox them to a satisfying level. So you have touched upon these international systemic actors enabling opportunities of economic growth and the central historical dilemmas upon which the Brazilian and Turkish states were established. And then in your processual logic, you walked us very nicely along the path of these critical junctures. And then you mentioned all these conditions changed or shifted, then these conflicts resurfaced. So I agree with this template, definitely. And these systemic or structural factors should be definitely accounted for. But then maybe you tend to see the state or the international system as monolithic structures rather than complex webs of agencies and interactions thoroughly saturated with culture, with ideologies, interests, and even emotions. And I think it is the comparative politics or IR disciplines that desperately miss this point and focus a lot on the absence or presence or either the opening and closures of these international opportunities. And I think, and I would even say that we take these simplified kind of ontological assumptions from the transition paradigm and we try to apply them in our research and expect to be able to explain the processes of democratization. So what was the transition paradigm? That is the presence of economic development denominated by these middle classes and enabling international system, a coalition of supporting actors with normative power, preferably reform-minded elites, or at least they pretend to be reform-minded, the presence of civil society. And now, although we reject the transition paradigm, because we know that there is no inevitable linear transformation from autocracy to democracy, perhaps we still stick to its core assumptions in the sense that their absence is enough to explain de-democratization or hybridization. So my question is, can we ontologically assume that if the presence of, let's say, variables X, Y, Z leads to the outcome A, in our case, democracy, then the absence of X, Y, Z really lead to no A. So what I'm trying to say is that hybridity, or what Turkey and Brazil or similar regimes have become, is definitely not an analogy that the absence of kind of structural factors for democratization get us far. And in the end, what I'm trying to say is the state and state structures and international system have multiple boundaries, allowing several forces to be active at different scales, and we need more and more unpacking of these relations and how they are shifted by the hands of the agents, maybe. And this brings me to my actually second point. And you definitely mentioned a lot the role of agency and agency of leaders, particularly how their pragmatism and even opportunism, particularly in case of Turkey, helped them to sail through the storms. But I would like to ask and discuss a little bit on the role of non-state actors in resisting and facilitating all these transitions, not only domestically, but also transnationally. So first of all, the role of non-state actors in resisting, facilitating this shift internally, how do they themselves change or adapt? And I think our major question here, when we speak about non-state actors, should be what makes citizens or constellation groupings of citizens, the civic space of citizens, convinced about the autocratic measures and practices? What makes non-state actors support this obscene political violence and denial of human rights that we see in Brazil and Turkey? If you like, what is the role of indoctrination, to put it more simply, maybe? And definitely there is a symbiosis here. The relationship is quite complex between non-state actors and regime or ruling elites. They are not there only to provide the foot soldiers to be mobilized when required by these regimes, and what these actors, non-state actors, receive or extract from the state maybe also should be accounted for. And it already tells us a lot about our ontological assumptions about the strict boundaries of the state limited to the formal powers. And also it tells a lot about the politics of interest intermediation, how it shifts as these regimes evolve from de-democratization towards whatever authoritarian path. But I would like to also say that non-state actors do not only assume facilitating role. You very well mentioned in 2013 there were protests, and I would go on and say that since Brazil and Turkey, they are just not midpoints between fully autocratic and liberal democracies, we should even expect more contention, more protests, and more dissent. And yes, we know there is dissent and contention, but maybe our next stop should be that a point that we pay more attention to whether contention can be sustained over time, and whether scale shift from scattered local level contention to national level is possible, and under what conditions. And again, it tells a lot, the presence of contention tells a lot, and nature of it, because even if it doesn't lead to great social revolution, it can still tell us a lot about the soft bellies of these regimes. The second subpoint is supposed to be about the role of non-state actors, but I don't think I have time for it. So I would like to just say that when this pie you mentioned was shrinking, internationally, definitely there were also non-state actors, armed groups, international financial actors operating and trying to, change and shift this internationally facilitating conditions. So I think I will conclude by saying that, first of all, we need to question our ontological assumptions about the role of structure and try to unpack this sort of complex relations between different agents and structures. And maybe we should try not to fall into the trap of this kind of reverse causal determinism about the factors of the democratization in a liberal term. And I would like to finish by saying that probably we need to expand our methodological toolkits to go deeper, to collect more primary data in different levels, at different formats, at different scales, to be able to do these things. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Bilge. Thank you very much for your points of departure for our discussion. And Karabekir, I think we can start by you responding to this, and then I'll open it to the questions.
Okay, thank you, Bilge. Very substantial points. I'll cheat a little bit and say that I actually thoroughly agree with you. The part of the reason that some of these things didn't come across and probably came across as much more deterministic or simplistic is because of trying to pack in so much in 15 minutes. As I said, I'm cheating. I'll cheat it even more, and to say that I won't be able to respond in a very comprehensive way in my limited time to your very comprehensive remarks. Let me just say on the first comment on the structural determinism. And this is where I wanted to sort of bring up or signal that I don't take structure as a given, and actually my work is critical about it. But when I said, decline to authoritarianism is not a destiny, it's not a foregone conclusion of geopolitics or institutions, but political actors, then I focused on the big political actors, but there are many levels of political agency, going to sort of civil society and organizational levels as well. are also very important in determining the course. In a sense, sort of, I think the way I see the relationship between structure and agency is, as Marx said in the 18th Brumaire, men make their own history, but they don't make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances that are already given and transmitted from the past. The only thing I would disagree with that is men. I would say people, okay? So that is, I think, the symbiotic relationship between structure and agency. And I think this is something that I will emphasize through this work. Now, the role of social actors and civil society actors are a major part of this story, which I didn't have any opportunity to actually emphasize. But they play a big role in the rise of both of these movements, in their transformation, and ultimately the sort of authoritarian decline of both countries. I mean, just to give you an example, the impeachment of Rousseff in Brazil was made possible by 3 years of relentless right-wing street demonstrations organized by very different interest groups, but ultimately linking and giving fuel to institutional stakeholders in the judiciary and in the parliament to act in a certain way. So that is one example. And now there's obviously a resistance from more progressive fields of Brazil to what's going on currently under the Bolsonaro regime. And in the case of Turkey as well, I think we cannot leave civil society out. There's an interesting difference I would point out on the basis of your work on civil society groups and government's relationship with these. You have emphasized in your recent articles that how the AKP government has created a sort of docile civil society environment, creating a sort of seemingly autonomous, or at least trying to nurture a seemingly autonomous civil society setting that was organically linked to the government in ideological or socio-economic ways. Civil society under the Labour Party remained much more autonomous in a truly sort of civil society way. The Labour Party, I keep saying Labour Party, it's actually Workers' Party. The Workers' Party in Brazil, part of its democratic sort of politics was not trying to push civil society under its own command. Ultimately, this is one of the explanatory factors for the divergence as well. And this is something that Erdogan keeps turning to whenever something happens in Brazil, and says, look at Brazil, it's because they didn't stand tall, they didn't do what we are doing, that the government is down. The global powers have brought the government down. Erdogan and the AKP's actions outside of democracy are legitimized via the democratic sort of experience of the Workers' Party in Brazil, which ended in a sort of catastrophe for the Brazilian left. So I think these are very tightly interconnected, and I will definitely take great care to reflect this on my work, and I really appreciate the substantial comments on that.
Thank you, Karabekir. Actually, the questions are really coming in, piling up at the moment. So hopefully we'll manage 2 rounds, and I'll start with the first few questions which have come in. And obviously Karabekir and both Karabekir and Bilge are welcome to respond. The first question is by Evren Dinçer and asks about the factor of resource richness versus geopolitics when comparing Turkey and Brazil. Brazil is a resource-rich country. Turkey isn't, but it has this. It is in the geopolitical mess it is. How does that account for differences? We have a question from Tim Dorlach from the Hanse Wissenschaftskolleg, who asks, what does it tell us about the ideological transformation of Erdogan and the AKP that we compare his development to the combined trajectory of Lula and Bolsonaro? Did Erdogan actually shift from the left to the right over time, or does the comparison fall short here? And there are a few questions on this ideological aspect, which Bilge also briefly responded to. We have a question from Sema Kılıçer here, who asks about the social dynamics in Brazil and Turkey and how they differ. How does the role of religion differ? What is the place of civil society? And how is religion used as a way of political manipulation? Zeynep Adar from the ILS Research Institute for Regional and Urban Development and the University of Duisburg-Essen asks, in Turkey, of course, we had the case of the academics who were ousted, knowledge workers who were ousted by a regime which is increasingly acting in a totalitarian way. Is there a similar pattern in the Brazilian case? And then finally, and with that, I want to close down the first round. And this comes from André de Munter from the European Parliament, whether Umberto Eco's notion of Ur-fascism actually helps us making sense when we compare these two leaders.
Wow.
And you have 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I'll be very brief in my responses specifically. I think the first question, the role of geopolitics, I try to emphasize the difference. In Latin American scene is very different from Middle East and even the Balkans, and I think that is an important sort of indicator in the way power struggles have shaped in Turkey vis-a-vis Brazil. But Brazil is internally also a very violent and unstable place. 60,000 deaths, homicides annually. There's almost like there's daily wars going on in the favelas. There is a different sort of geopolitical mess internally in Brazil that I think also adds into the picture. They're very different, but I think it's important to also take note. And of course, the resource richness and poorness makes a difference. However, when we look at it, from the Brazil's perspective of Brazil, resource richness didn't save Brazil from going down in the path of economic recession. Brazil's economy was very much reliant on China's hunger for resources, and when the Chinese economy started sort of slowing down, this really hit Brazil hard. So in a way, Brazil was also dependent on international markets as Turkey was economically, and this sort of manifests itself in different ways. The second one, the comparison, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't look at the transformation or trajectory of Erdogan from the perspective of left and right. It's much more sort of fluid and idiosyncratic, I would say. Combined populist measures in both the liberal and the authoritarian eras. I think he is simply much more adept at picking the tools that will help him in a given moment, in a given circumstance, than was Lula, for instance. I mean, whether it's use of populist tools and rhetorics, liberal tools and rhetorics, he knew how to ride the waves, that were rising and falling. Again, this goes into my sort of structural, I think, perspective, but I think he was much more aware of where, the flow was going to, and he sort of instrumentalized this in a ruthless way, more than any other leader that we see. I mean, how many elected leaders have we seen that are around for 17 years? Erdogan really is, in that sense, quite an interesting phenomenon. The third question was about civil society, which I tried to also engage with Bilge's question, but I could say one thing about the use of religion. Religion has risen as a sort of a very important tool in politics of Brazil as well, especially in the context of the rising power and influence of the evangelical Christians and their involvement in politics. You might be more familiar with this in the framework of the United States. It's not very different in Brazil, but they have a strong presence in the current government, and they play this very conservative role. So perhaps there's some comparison to be drawn in the sort of role of religion in politics and society, in political Islam and in evangelical Christianity. The threats against academics, this is a very good question, and a question that I've been posed a lot by my colleagues here in Brazil, who were so worried when Bolsonaro came and wanted to talk to me about my experience or my colleagues' experiences. And things are deteriorating here as well. starting from cuts to federal fundings for research and science, then to purges or attempted purges in universities, targeting left-wing scholars, putting certain obstacles before them. The one thing that prevented this from going down at a very sort of ruthless path was the fact that university rectors at the federal and state level, university rectors in public universities in Brazil were still autonomously selected by the universities, unlike in Turkey. So that created a sort of obstacle to the government getting inside the universities. 2 weeks ago, the government passed an executive decree legitimized by the emergency of the pandemic, saying that Brazil's national interests necessitate the executive branch to directly appoint university rectors. So this is, Brazil going down the same path of Turkey in terms of civil society and especially academia at a very fast rate. And my final sort of remark or response to Andre's question on Urfascism is that I think I would have to think a bit more on it, but I think it does give us a sort of good blueprint to understand these sort of very different but also similar movements and leaders. Let me just say that in this case, Bolsonaro is not just a populist. He really is an openly sort of a proud authoritarian, lover of military dictatorship. And if we had needed a definition for fascism in the 21st century, I think he would be that definition.
Oh, thank you, Karabekir. Bilge, I think it seems that we won't have time for a second round, but also there are no more questions coming in. So Bilge, maybe you would like to respond. There's also a last question which came in from Alessandro Porra, who asks, will Turkish civil society survive Erdogan authoritarianism? So maybe you want to start on that note and then we'll wrap up.
I think that's a tough question. Well, depends on, all right, I'm always on the positive side. And of course, when you have repression, there is resistance and it's gonna be there. So I'm quite in favor of seeing civil society and social movements and contention rather than one-off events or wildcat protests as one line of continuation, as a long-term fight. And I am not an expert on Brazilian politics, but what I can say about Turkey is that 2013 Gezi protest was a real critical juncture. And when I do my research in the field on civil society, it seems very polarized, yes, between the government, pro-government ones and the autonomous ones, or the ones that are trying to be autonomous and operating at the same time. But those ones, they always look back at Gezi 2013 as a moment of a critical moment when they realized that the fight, the resistance is no longer possible in the political arena because the opposition has no meaningful access to political institutions, and now they have to turn to civic space and mobilize. And this is what I'm trying to argue, and what I've seen really, because regimes like Brazil and Turkey and similar ones, they create a sort of dilemma for themselves because they have to operationalize the civil society as the civic space for resilience because they want to target certain groups and reach out to those groups, and they cannot shut down civic space like in proper good old authoritarian countries and regimes. And this creates a dilemma because if you sort of selectively repress certain parts of civic space, then they will open other spaces for contention and for mobilization. And there is usually a kind of bell curve, right? The more the repression increases, the more resistance increase and contention increase. This is the generic, what the social movement theory tells us. But to what extent the regime has the capacity and willingness to oppress, and to what extent the counter societal movements will respond to this is just something really on context-based, contextual. And so far, we see that, yes, there is scattered, local, sometimes even not very visible resistance, but it's there. It is kicking. It is fighting back. And yes, let's hope that it's going to survive. And yeah, civil society will remain when maybe autocrats are gone. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bilge. Karabekir, a last word on this.
Oh, on, well, okay, I wasn't expecting that. The survival of civil society under Erdogan and in Brazil, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they will survive. I mean, these countries are too complex. The societies are too deeply layered. And, you know, even in our modern times, the attempts to completely domesticate society have failed, at least have failed to pass a certain level, even under moments of greatest repression. Civil society, you know, autonomous and independent thinking and movements have survived. And they maybe had to go underground, they had to lay low for a while. In our current circumstance, you know, this is also including internationalization of civil society. You know, academics are scattered all over the place, but they're not gone, especially, you know, with these technological means, we're still speaking out. So I think it's, you know, very difficult, despite the technological advancements of a nation state level government, national government, to suffocate civil society entirely. So that is a hopeful note to, I guess, you know, end on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karabekir. Thank you, Bilge. This has been a wonderful first online talk on Turkey. So I'd like to thank you also on behalf of the organizers, that is Blickwechsel, the Consortium of European Symposia on Turkey, and Network Turkey. It has been a true pleasure having you today. And of course, we hope to see you again on our next online talk on Turkey. So please make sure that you are signed up with the mailing list of Network Turkey on www.network/turkey.org. And you should have also received this anyway when you signed up, to hear about the upcoming talks and events. So for now, I think we've had a wonderful discussion. Goodbye from Chicago, and see you at another Network Turkey event. Bye-bye.